When looking over some of the superhero movie series that have reached screens, definitely one of the most popular and iconic is the Spider-Man trilogy Sam Raimi directed in the 2000s. Prior to that, there were several attempts to make a theatrical movie starring the web crawler, with a variety of studios and filmmakers taking a crack on the material. At one point, James Cameron even became involved in an adaptation which he was initially going to direct after True Lies. He wrote a lengthy treatment which was a more adult take on the character. That version never happened, but it probably remains one of the biggest what-ifs in film history. When Sony Pictures got the rights, they had a list of potential candidates to direct, and in the end Sam Raimi got the job. He was a fan of the character and wanted to retain the everyman qualities that made him so popular, and I think he succeeded very well. There's a certain charm that Raimi brings to the first Spider-Man movie as it depicts Peter Parker gaining his superpowers. It keeps what Stan Lee and Steve Ditko wanted to do with Peter by showing him dealing with problems that any young person might face, and while he has his good qualities, he does not always make the right decision. He has his occasional outbursts and can be jealous of others. A lot of his decision-making even comes from his desire to impress Mary Jane Watson. He's a flawed character while also showing the difficulties that can come from growing up. The casting of Tobey Maguire was a pivotal one, and he successfully depicts Peter's dorky personality, as well as the multiple emotions he goes through. The movie does a good job of showing him figuring out his powers, although a notable change from the comics was his web shooters being organic rather than Peter using mechanical devices he built himself. This was actually an idea utilized in James Cameron's treatment, and was then carried over to Raimi's film. This has gotten a divisive reaction from comic book fans. I'll admit, as someone who had little familiarity with the comics when I first saw this movie, I assumed this was always part of the character. As a result, it has never bothered me, and I think it also works in streamlining the narrative by not spending a significant amount of screen time on Peter building the web shooters. After all, this movie has to go through his origin story, and then his battle with the Green Goblin, and develop his relationship with Mary Jane in the span of 2 hours. One script draft even had both the Goblin and Dr. Octopus, but it was smartly decided to save Doc Ock for a sequel. Speaking of which, the Goblin becomes a fun villain, largely because of Willem Dafoe's performance. They went with a Jekyll and Hyde approach with the character, as Norman Osborn becomes consumed by this chemical he injects into himself and turns him insane. However, we still see a few glimpses of his good qualities peeking out underneath, and his struggle to deal with this other darker personality. Dafoe does a great job of showing both sides of Norman. Although on my recent viewing, I did notice something interesting about the Green Goblin's actions in the movie. When he first becomes the Goblin, his plan is to destroy his competitors and the Oscorp board of directors who vote to force Norman out of his company. He quickly accomplishes that, and then spends the rest of the movie just messing with Spider-Man. So if Peter had never been bitten by a radioactive spider and become a superhero, what would the Green Goblin have pivoted to doing? Just flying around New York on his glider, cackling to himself? One of the most enjoyable aspects of the movie comes from J.K. Simmons playing J. Jonah Jameson. He completely embraces the comic book origins of the character and brings so much life to this newspaper editor, mostly thinking about the next headline and how he can use Spider-Man to sell issues of the Bugle. Cliff Robertson and Rosemary Harris also deserve a mention as Uncle Ben and Aunt May. They bring such a warmth to those characters, showing their concern for Peter as he seems to go through these changes, and it becomes heartbreaking when Ben is killed. Raimi handled the action sequences quite well as we see Spidey swinging through New York. Admittedly, a few of the effects can look a little dodgy, especially when Peter first jumps from rooftop to rooftop, but this was the first time they were trying out these sorts of effects on Spider-Man, and they did the best they could with technology available at the time. Another key element came from Danny Elfman's score, which gave Spider-Man a fitting theme, and I especially like the use of drums. A lot was riding on this movie, and Raimi and the rest of the production team pulled it off, providing an entertaining ride that also gave Peter Parker a solid arc as he learns that with great power comes great responsibility. The general consensus on Spider-Man 2 is that's the best film of the trilogy, and I agree with that opinion. Sam Raimi took what worked in the previous film and improved upon them as Peter deals with new problems. What I find remarkable about the sequel is how it's able to juggle so many storylines. You have Peter's superheroics, him still pining for Mary Jane, him losing his powers and giving up being Spider-Man, Doc Ock's storyline, and Harry Osborn's storyline, plus other things going on with Aunt May, the Daily Bugle, and Mary Jane's wedding. The movie has to develop all these stories in about 2 hours, and does it extremely well. Nothing ever feels underdeveloped in Spider-Man 2, and each part feels significant to what's going on with these characters. Although I think a particularly daring choice was having Peter not be Spider-Man for a good chunk of the film, as you would think a sequel would have even more scenes of him in the costume swinging around and stopping criminals. Again, Peter embodies that everyman quality in his struggle of balancing all the problems going on in his life. He is essentially leading a double life, trying to be a good person, all the while making money from the sensationalist headlines he takes photographs of himself for, and knowing his best friend hates his alter ego for thinking he killed his father. I think one of the tougher scenes to watch is when he confesses to Aunt May what he was really doing the day Uncle Ben was shot. Raimi heightens the awkwardness of that moment with the way he lingers on the faces, and you see Aunt May's heartbreak. It's another example of the difficulties Peter faces as he tries to do what's right. As for Otto Octavius, aka Dr. Octopus, I think he might be one of the best superhero movie villains ever. The film does so well in setting him up and showing his intelligence and desire to help other people with his science, so it becomes heartbreaking when he gets corrupted by his own invention. Alfred Molina gave an excellent performance as he plays Otto so determined to complete his work and be consumed by this goal, he does not realize the danger of what he's doing. Although, and this is true, one draft of the screenplay had Otto as a younger character with a crush on Mary Jane. I'm glad that's not the version of the character we got, especially since it would have meant not seeing Molina in the role. There are other great character moments here too, like May talking to Peter about what it means to be a hero. It's a really well-run speech, and there's some lines here that possibly hint at her knowing Peter is Spider-Man. Meanwhile, J. Jonah Jameson was given even funnier scenes in the sequel, and I love his arc of dealing with Spider-Man throwing away the tights and possibly giving up. Raimi took the action to the next level here, with the train sequence being one of the highlights of the film. When Peter becomes Spider-Man again after abandoning the persona for a while, it's such a great triumphant moment as he finally realizes what he needs to do. The visual effects also saw a major upgrade here, especially with Doc Ock's tentacles. Raimi even got the opportunity to include a bit of his Evil Dead side with the hospital scene. Honestly, I feel I could probably mention several scenes in the movie I love, as Raimi delivered one great sequence after another. Spider-Man 2 succeeded in packing so much spectacle and heart into its story, which is also credit to Alvin Sargent, who was able to combine the various drafts by other writers and implement some of his and Raimi's ideas to create something really entertaining. Next came Spider-Man 3, which stands as the most divisive entry in the trilogy. While the response to the first two movies has remained fairly consistent since their release, the feelings surrounding the third one are all over the map. Some really hate it and find it a massive step down, others see it as an underappreciated gem, and there are those who are just kind of on the movie. My opinion has strangely gone slightly up and down over the years, as I tend to have a different reaction whenever I watch Spider-Man 3, but I do overall like it. What I find most interesting about the movie is its exploration on the effect that Spider-Man's fame has on Peter. He grows a bit of an ego here as he watches the city fawn over Spider-Man, and we see the effect this has in his relationships, and particularly when the symbiote attaches itself to Peter. The idea of the symbiote is that it heightens someone's negative traits, so what would a Peter starting to think a little too highly about himself act when under its control? It's also why he becomes such an easy target for the symbiote and loses himself to it. I know his behavior in the movie has become a meme, but Peter is a dork, and so it's fitting that his idea of being cool would be strutting down the street like John Travolta, although who knew he was such a big Bob Fosse fan? The main villain is Flint Marko, aka the Sandman, with Thomas Hayden Church bringing sympathy to the character as he just wants to help his sick daughter. I think one of the most standout scenes in the movie is right after he transforms and he sees his new body. The visual effects team did a fantastic job of getting all the details right and having the emotion come through in the Sandman's expressions. Raimi also put together some solid action sequences, like Peter's fights with Harry and the Sandman. And while Danny Elfman did not return to compose the score, I really like Christopher Young's musical pieces. Funnily enough, Young's score sounds even more Elfman-esque than the music in the previous two movies. Looking at the story as a whole, the thing that struck me when watching the movie again was that it's basically a soap opera. There's a lot of emphasis on Peter's relationship troubles, including with Mary Jane and then going on a date with Gwen Stacy. We have two best friends at odds with each other over secrets being kept, and there's even an amnesia subplot. A common theme in Spider-Man 3 is that of revenge. We have Peter wanting to avenge the death of Uncle Ben after finding out Flint was responsible, Harry seeking revenge on his father's death, and Eddie Brock wanting to get back at Peter. It shows what can happen when a desire for revenge can take us to a dark place, and they need to claw out of that dangerous mindset. I also want to talk about Mary Jane, as I was surprised to learn there are people who hate her character. However, revisiting the trilogy, I actually found her one of the most sympathetic characters, especially when you look at it from her perspective. This is someone coming from an abusive home, dealing with the difficulties of becoming an actress. In the meantime, she sees Peter pining for her, then rejecting her, and then wanting to be with her again even after she's engaged. Then in the third movie, once they are together, he does not seem to understand her feelings as he soaks up the attention of being the city's beloved savior. He suddenly becomes a jerk and even hits her at one point, all the while she's been frequently kidnapped and almost killed by his enemies. Mary Jane goes through so much in these movies, I end up feeling really bad for her. Of course, one of the most controversial decisions was the way Venom was shoehorned into the plot. This was at the insistence of producer Avi Arad, who was a big fan of the character, but Raimi needed a bit more convincing to include him. Raimi's disinterest makes sense when you look at Eddie Brock and Venom compared to the other villains in the trilogy. There's a common thread with Norman Osborn, Otto Octavius, and Flint Marko, as while they are flawed, we see they are well-meaning and are not necessarily bad people. Once they are transformed in a scientific accident, that's when they make the turn to villainy and resort to purposely hurting others to achieve some gain. However, Eddie has basically no redeeming qualities, and before he even becomes Venom, he wishes death on Peter. He's not that interesting or fleshed out a character as presented here, and he's just kind of a twerp. As a result, when he becomes Venom, his personality does not change at all. The movie even takes every opportunity to show Eddie's face instead of having him completely as Venom. Spider-Man 3 just cannot quite balance the multiple subplots as easily as the second film did, but I think there are enough interesting ideas and good moments here that I don't mind it. However, Sam Raimi has long been open about the third film not being up to his satisfaction, so when work began on Spider-Man 4, he made it clear to Sony that he would only direct it if the script met his high standards. The plan was to make Vulture the central villain this time, with John Malkovich as the main candidate for the role. Black Cat was also revealed to be a secondary antagonist with Anne Hathaway in negotiations. We might have additionally seen Dr. Kirk Connors finally transform into the Lizard after the character appeared in the second and third movies. Sony penciled in a May 2011 release date, but Raimi was not pleased with any of the drafts he read, and feeling he did not have time to get the movie made by the studio's preferred date, he decided to drop out. This led to Sony rebooting the Spider-Man franchise with Mark Webb in the director's chair and Andrew Garfield as Peter Parker. The Amazing Spider-Man opened in 2012, so maybe if Sony had given Raimi an extra year, he could have gotten Spider-Man 4 out around then too. Oh well, we did eventually get to see Tobey Maguire return to the role in No Way Home, which provided a very satisfying catch-up with him years later. The Spider-Man movies we got under Sam Raimi proved to be highly entertaining, with him finding the needed depth for Peter's struggles in balancing his life and superheroism. They had the right amount of emotion, winning humor, exciting action sequences, and compelling villains, and serve as a worthy adaptation of this iconic Marvel hero. See you next time.